we have to talk about sexuality not just in terms of behavior, but in terms of design.
John, this next one is one of those messages that I just wish we would never receive, but we do receive them from time to time. And it's tough, and it requires profound pastoral wisdom and parental love and a Christian orientation in all of your thinking to answer a question this tough. So let's try our hand at it with fear and trembling here. This person writes in, I've enjoyed the Breakpoint commentary for some time and I'm so grateful for your work and passion for God's truth. I'm a mom of 3 teens and a clergy spouse. A few days ago, my beautiful 15-year-old daughter confided in me that she is pansexual. I have so many questions. While I'm glad she wanted to share this with me, it has me grieving at the confusion all around our young people. Can you recommend a resource for my husband and I as we walk prayerfully through this and seek to love her fully and well?
Man, it's a painful question. I agree. I wish we wouldn't get these questions, but we do. We get them increasingly frequently, actually, and it's heartbreaking. I'm going to let you take the first stab at this one,
Okay.
Shane, if you would.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is to try to understand what's probably going on here and ask some questions to see whether it's the case, because it's likely the case. Lisa Littman wrote about, who is a sociologist, wrote about this and got in a bunch of trouble for writing about this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria or LGBT identities in groups of young people, particularly young women in a school setting, functioning like a social contagion, especially, like I said, among girls. So there's always been a feature of teenage life where you get around your friends, the peer pressure begins, and you start to reimagine yourself along the lines of what's cool, what gets you attention, what gets you praise, what makes you distinct from everyone else, what makes you stand out. And that's always run along the lines of the way you dress or what music you listen to or the friends you hang out with or the style. I remember back when I was back in the bygone era, before all this stuff became super mainstream, where you'd become like a goth or a jock or something like that. You pick an identity. This is Lisa Littman argues that this is very much in the pool of identities now, an LGBT identity, a sexual or gender orientation or expression that is now the way you distinguish yourself as a teenager. What that means is that someone coming to you, someone of a young age, teenage, middle school, high school, coming to you and saying, I'm X, I'm pansexual, I'm bisexual, I'm a lesbian, I'm transgender, shouldn't be taken automatically at face value as a statement about sex itself or gender itself. It may be very much the case that you're looking at that social contagion component, especially if you ask some questions and find out that this is something that's happening a lot in your child's social circle. You find out that they're being influenced in this direction, that somebody else that they're close with came out recently as one of these identities. You have to consider that as a possibility and then be encouraged by the fact that in almost all of these instances, statistically, kids change their mind later on. So with specifically the transgender issue, the research says that something like 8 out of 10 kids who identify as transgender in their minor years will desist at some point later in life, where once they mature, they realize that's not for me. The same thing is going to be true with identities like pansexual to some extent. You're going to be in a situation where your daughter is going to be saying things like, "It's not a phase, mom. This is who I really am." The stereotypical phrase, and that's got to be heartbreaking and scary. I'm just watching, my wife deal with the fact that a childhood friend, has declared herself gay, and just the consternation that's caused Gabby and the way it's caused her to question all of their interactions prior to that. the same thing is going to be true to a much greater extent, I think, with a parent. As far as resources and dealing with the specific claim of being pansexual, there are going to be a few books that you're going to want to check out that will help you kind of wrap your mind around what is probably going on here, and then in light of that, deal with the repercussions in a loving, parental, pastorally wise way. So Christopher Yuan's book, Holy Sexuality, we talked about that a while back when it came out on Breakpoint, and that's a good reorientation to help you understand what the real goal of sex is. It's not it's not an orientation. Sex is not God's ideal for sex is not that we be heterosexual, so to speak. It's that we be holy in our sexuality. And it points us back to a goal, the true purpose of why God made us male and female. And he's writing this from a perspective of, immense experience and grief from having come out of a very outspoken gay lifestyle. So there's a lot of wisdom in that book. Sean McDowell's Chasing Love, which is a more recent entry, is probably the best introduction to natural law, classical thinking about Christian thinking about sex that I've seen from a completely layperson's perspective. It is extremely accessible. It's short. It's easy. You could give it to a teenager, and in fact, that's what it's meant for. And expect them very much to understand and follow his argument. And it's done very winsomely. I interviewed him on the Upstream podcast, and it was a great conversation. That is a strong entry when it comes to just figuring out what sexuality is all about and why God cares. And then, there are a bunch of other books that come to mind, but one of the books that will help you and probably your daughter ask the right questions before answering anything is going to be Trevin Wax's book, Rethink Yourself. I've mentioned it several times on the podcast, and I also interviewed him on Upstream, but it was just a really excellent and eye-opening book that helped me, and I know has helped a lot of other people, to see the cultural moment we're in, to see the way we talk about sex as a component of identity is really a function of how we think about selfhood. This goes back to Carl Trueman's much thicker, much more academic book on the same subject or similar subject. It comes back to, who are we as selves? What do we mean when you say I'm X? I am this identity, and is it historically normative? And is it Christian to begin your life by looking inside of yourself, finding whatever desire is in there, and then saying, okay, my life is going to be an expression of that desire, and I want all the world to conform to that? Is that a rational, godly, productive, happiness-bringing way to structure your life? And Trevin's answer is very much no. Not only is it very new historically to look in first to figure out who you are, but it actually leads to great unhappiness and uncertainty and isolation. And so before you even start to talk about sex and gender and who you're attracted to or whatnot, the bigger question to ask is, who am I as a person? And why do I think that's who I am, as opposed to the way that most people through history have oriented their identity, shaped their identity, and the way that the Bible teaches us to shape our identity, first by looking up to God. So those are my 3 recommendations, and I hope they're helpful. And I will say a prayer for this particular young lady and her mother.
I just want to add a little nuance to your first point, which was, I think, well considered to think about how these things kind of take over a community, particularly of young people, especially of young girls, is what we are seeing.
That's just statistically true. Young girls are very likely to fall prey to this kind of social contagion.
The thing I would just nuance is that I think we need to think about it oftentimes deeper, or sometimes it's not really about being cool. There certainly is a peer pressure side of it. But there was an experience we had years ago, and I won't go into all the details because it would be too rambly, but where a group of guidance counselors, we were instructed to ask them if, because of a particular thing happening in this little town where I used to live, if there was an uptick in the number of students coming out as gay and lesbian. And we called the guidance counselors, and they said absolutely. And the reason is because in a time where there is increasing reason for students to struggle with identity, to not know who they are, to feel disenfranchised, maybe too legitimate beyond just kind of cultural lostness, but in mixed messages in media, but maybe abuse, or maybe some sort of hurt, some sort of abandonment, a bad experience with religious authorities or something like that. These are all things that are more than just supposed to be good influences in our life. They're supposed to be things that stabilize us. And when those things don't stabilize us, we feel lost, we feel disenfranchised. And there's even, obviously the personality of the shy kid or the awkward kid or something like that. There's all kinds of factors that could leave somebody really disoriented, especially in that really difficult adolescent time, especially for girls. And so then you tend to find the other people who seem disenfranchised too, and then you identify there, because it's a place of stability, or it looks as if the plight that's being described by that community is the same plight. So, oh, that must be who I am. In other words, it can be rooted into more than just a desire to be cool.
Yeah, right. And I didn't mean to sort of trivialize it that way. And what you're pointing to, John, is the thing that historically has fueled gangs with young men, where there's this desire to belong, and it's a substitute family, and that can very much happen as well in the sexuality arena.
So that's but that's an important thing to consider. And I don't know what the story is. There's always a story behind all these things, which is why resources and books are helpful about some things and not helpful in some other ways. The question, and especially the statement by this daughter that she is pansexual, does assume this category of sexual orientation. And there's not a single other place in the culture right now, including the church, that would be willing to have the hard conversation about the idea of sexual orientation itself. This is such a critical thing to not assume, and to say, before we go there, like, for example, this happens in homeschool communities where a student will, say that identify as a particular, sexual orientation, but they've never acted out on it. They've never done it. And so it's an assumption. You can see the assumption in the language that because I feel a particular way, it's who I am. And it doesn't matter if I've ever or not acted out on it or ever would. Well, why is sexuality now being defined by my impulse as opposed to my actual behavior? This is new. This is not something that goes back in history. This is not something in which, as this translates over into gender, where it's not what you do, but, what you feel is more important than, genetics or chromosomes. This is a new idea about the human person. This is a new idea about sexual orientation. And at 15, if your daughter is claiming a particular orientation, she's old enough to have that conversation and go, let's really look at this category, because this is not, people have throughout history put themselves in particular categories and put other people in particular categories that we now realize are bogus, that they're culturally constructed and they're not actually reflections of what is. What if this falls into that category? And to actually question that itself, I think, is an essential thing to do, because it is taken for granted. But I just want to warn you, the hard part about this conversation is, and this is why it's so damaging when the church refuses to address this. And I'm not saying the church has always addressed this well, but there's not a single place in culture where this category of what it means to be human is up in the air. It's like this was suggested yesterday, and now it's largely embraced. So have that conversation about the idea of sexual orientation. There's an article that was written several years ago in First Things. It's not an easy read, so it's not something I would give to her as a 15-year-old, but maybe something that could help you have this conversation. And I think it's called The Invention of Heterosexuality. We'll find it and put it on the website. And basically talking about the idea of being a heterosexual or homosexual as a category of being human is just new. Just didn't exist. Sexuality was seen as what you did to live out the impulses that you have. whichever direction your impulses took you was far
Yeah.
less important than
That
how
was
you
I think
actually
you're
acted
thinking
on
of
it.
Against Heterosexuality by Michael Hannon.
That's the title.
It
Yeah,
was in
we'll link
First
to it,
Things.
Against Heterosexuality. Yeah, and First Things. And it's just it's an interesting thing to think about. He caught a lot of flack for it because, again, no one's having this conversation. No one's willing to have it, but they need to be willing to have it.
Yeah.
I want to point the the parents here in this to a website called Live Hope, Live hope.org, Live Hope, run by my good friend Ricky Shillette. There's not a lot of these organizations left, and one of the things that this organization does is support parents.
Hmm.
At the same homeschool conference 4 years apart, I had a mom tell me that her daughter was a lesbian, and a mom tell me that her son was not the same mom, but another mom tell me that her son wanted to become a girl. And I asked both of them, "Who are you talking to?" And they both said, "There's nobody we can talk to." When you're talking about a pastor, he's going to have a really hard time finding any sort of perspective or support or encouragement, mentoring on this. And that's a tragic thing right now. It's a sin in the church that we don't realize how hard it is to be a parent. And when we share these struggles with others, this is not a reason to excommunicate someone. Is because their kid is a victim of the sexual revolution. And unfortunately, that's what's effectively happening. And I get it. I have young kids. I struggle with this personally where, okay, what do I want to expose them to and how and why and what does that look like? And I get that. But I tell you, we're leaving moms and dads high and dry, and we're asking them to navigate these waters, and there's very, very little for them to go on. It's one thing, to send you to an academic article in First Things, which I still think you should read, and another thing to get ongoing support to navigate these waters. Because look, even if Shane's right, which he is statistically, that most children who struggle with this or who go to a fad for one reason or another grow out of it, and you should get some hope from that. Between now and then is hell.
Hmm.
Between now and the next 3 years is absolutely awful, especially if there's no one to lean whose shoulder you can cry on, who can just ask the hard questions and you can give the hard truths to. This is as hard as it gets.
Hmm.
And especially if you're in a place of ministry or something like that, harder to fail out loud.
Yeah.
And it's a real tragedy, and we desperately need to find places where we can find that sort of support. I love Ricky. His story is not unlike Chris Yuan's story. It's again livehope.org. They've got a number of resources. Unfortunately, since Exodus International closed down, there's just not a lot of places to go, and there's not a lot of places that have kept up with the ever evolving sexual orientations and the increasing list of names in the acronym. So unfortunately, I wish this is one of those things where I wish I could just list off 20 different things. I mean, there's books and they're great, but the sort of support that a mom and dad needs to walk through this. I mean, she needs to ask how, we don't have any idea here from the question how old the siblings are. If this is the oldest daughter, that's a really challenging situation. If this is the youngest child, that's a different and equally challenging situation. If this is the middle child, I mean, all of these factors matter in experience, and because their concern is for this girl that she figures out who God wants her to be, but then also for the other siblings and extended family in the church as well. Last thing I'll say is simply we have to talk about sexuality not just in terms of behavior, but in terms of design. So a lot of times that disenfranchisement can come from not necessarily knowing how someone fits in with a gender stereotype or gender norms in a culture, and going back to say, look, I love the adjective that that questioner used about her daughter, my beautiful 15-year-old daughter. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, I don't know if that's a statement on her physical appearance or a statement on just how she's grown up and her brilliance or whatever, but understanding the design and that God's design for sexuality is good, and it's usually larger and wider than just that normal stereotypes in our culture is something you can only get by going back to the garden. And we talk a lot about roles when it comes to masculinity and femininity. And roles are very difficult things to base anything on because they change culturally, even inside the church. So you got to go back to the design. What does God create men for? What does God create women for? This is the where we're beginning our Wilberforce weekend with talking about that because it's essential. So we've given this poor woman way more than she probably wanted. But I join with you in saying, you'll be in our prayers. These are difficult times, and I know that for every question we get, there's a whole lot more who haven't asked the question but find themselves in that same situation. All the resources that we just talked about we'll list at breakpoint.org.
And John and I are both in the trenches on this. We have children. Mine are younger than his, but although one of my kids is close to the same age as Hunter. But yeah, I mean, this is stuff we have to put into practice as well, every bit as much in our lives. So God bless you. Thank you so much for sending this question, and we'll be praying for you.